Ever open up the financial news and see experts agonizing over the interest rate, only to quickly realize there isn't actually just one monolithic number? Instead, there's this dizzying array of rates out there. You've got rates for mortgages, rates for government bonds, rates for corporations, and they are all constantly moving and shifting. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to deconstruct exactly why interest rates vary so much, and we'll take a really close look at the architecture running behind the global financial system, the structure of interest rates. Let's dive in. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the interest rate mystery. Second, risk structure, where we look at same maturities. Third, term structure, covering different maturities. Fourth, three yield curve theories. And finally, using the yield curve in the real world.
Section 1. The interest rate mystery.
So, why do two completely different bonds pay out entirely different amounts of money? To figure this out, we have to perform what I call the big split. We essentially need to separate the universe of interest rates into two distinct frameworks. On one side, we have the risk structure. This asks a specific question. Why do bonds with similar terms to maturity, let's say two different bonds that both lock up your money for exactly 10 years, have entirely different interest rates? Then, on the other side, we have the term structure. This flips the script entirely and asks, why do bonds with different terms to maturity, like a 1-year bond versus a 10-year bond, have different rates? We've got to tackle these puzzles one at a time.
Section 2. Risk structure. Same maturities.
Okay, if we look exclusively at bonds with the exact same maturity date, why do they pay out differently? The answer boils down to four key invisible factors that dictate a bond's interest rate in the present moment. We're looking at default risk, liquidity, administration or information costs, and taxation. You can think of these as a sort of desirability checklist. If a bond is exceptionally risky, hard to sell, expensive to research, or heavily taxed, investors are obviously going to demand a higher interest rate just to compensate them for taking it on. Let's look at exactly how this plays out in the market with our very first factor.
Let's see what fear actually looks like in the market. Imagine a corporation suffers massive losses, meaning they might not be able to pay back their debt. That is default risk. If you look at the corporate bond side of things, you'll see the demand curve shifting sharply to the left. Investors are fleeing. This drops the price of the bond, but critically, it forces the interest rate up just to attract anyone willing to take on that level of risk. But where does all that fleeing money go? It runs straight for the safety of default-free U.S. Treasury bonds. Demand over there shifts to the right, driving Treasury prices up and their interest rates down. And this brilliantly illustrates the concept of a risk premium. That gap between the high corporate rate and the low Treasury rate, that is the exact mathematical premium investors are demanding to stomach the corporate risk. Ultimately, every bond with default risk has a positive risk premium.
Now let's move over to taxation and see how this builds our understanding. Think about municipal bonds. Normally, these are riskier and less liquid than Treasury bonds, so you naturally expect them to pay a higher interest rate, right? But what if the government grants them tax-free status? Suddenly, their after-tax expected return skyrockets. Notice how demand for municipal bonds jumps to the right. Their price goes up, and surprisingly, their interest rate falls. Meanwhile, fully taxed Treasury bonds become way less desirable, so their demand drops and their interest rates rise. The really crucial takeaway here is that investors will gladly accept a lower interest rate on a riskier asset just so long as the tax advantages make up for it.
Section 3. Term structure. Different maturities.
So now that we've got risk structured down, what happens when we hold risk constant and only change time? To measure the effect of time, economists use a brilliant tool called the yield curve. It's simply a plot of the yields or interest rates on bonds with differing terms to maturity. But the golden rule of the yield curve is that risk, liquidity, information cost, and taxation are all held absolutely identical. By keeping all of those risk structure factors exactly the same, the yield curve gives us this pure, unadulterated look at how time alone impacts money. When economists actually started plotting these yield curves, they noticed some undeniable patterns. They established three fundamental facts of the market. First, interest rates on bonds of different maturities move together over time. So if short-term rates go up, long-term rates generally follow. Second, when short-term rates are currently low, the yield curve tends to slope upward. But when short-term rates are high, it tends to slope downward, or invert. And third, broadly speaking across history, yield curves almost always slope upward. These three facts are our ultimate test. Any economic theory attempting to explain the term structure absolutely must be able to explain all three of these facts, or it just gets thrown out.
Section 4. Three yield curve theories. Over the decades, some truly brilliant minds have stepped up to try and explain these three facts. And the entire battle between their theories boils down to one massive assumption. Our bonds of different maturities substitute goods. Let's trace this out. The pure expectations theory assumes that a 1-year bond and a 10-year bond are perfect substitutes, meaning investors don't really care about the time frame, only the ultimate yield. The segmented markets theory takes the exact opposite extreme. It argues they are not substitutes at all, and that short-term and long-term bonds exist in completely separate, isolated markets. Finally, the liquidity premium theory sits right in the middle, assuming they are substitutes, but only imperfectly. Let's see how they actually score against our three facts.
The pure expectations theory does an awesome job explaining why rates move together and how short-term rate expectations shape the curve. It perfectly explains facts 1 and 2. But because it assumes investors don't prefer any specific time frame, it completely fails to explain fact 3, why the curve almost always slopes upward. The segmented markets theory steps in and says, aha, the curve slopes upward because investors naturally prefer short-term holding periods, so demand is just higher there. That brilliantly explains fact 3. But because it assumes the markets are totally separate, it totally whiffs on facts 1 and 2. It can't explain why the rates actually move together. So neither extreme works on its own.
And this is exactly where the grand unifying solution comes into play, the liquidity premium and preferred habitat theories. By combining elements of both of those flawed extremes, it works beautifully. It acknowledges that bonds of different maturities are substitutes, so their rates definitely do influence each other and move together. But they're imperfect substitutes. Why? Because investors inherently prefer the habitat of short-term, highly liquid money markets. Much like animals prefer their specific habitat in the wild, an investor will only step out of their comfortable short-term habitat and lock their money up for 10 years if you pay them a liquidity premium. This perfectly, finally, explains all three facts.
Let's look at exactly how this unifying theory predicts the shape of the yield curve in the real world. If the market expects future short-term rates to rise, the curve slopes steeply upward, combining those high future expectations with the ever-present liquidity premium. Now, even if future rates are expected to stay exactly the same, the curve still slopes slightly upward, and that's entirely because of that liquidity premium we just learned about. It gets really fascinating if rates are expected to fall moderately. The downward pull is essentially canceled out by the upward push of the liquidity premium, resulting in a completely flat curve. And finally, only if rates are expected to fall sharply will the curve actually invert and slope downward. The liquidity premium theory handles every single scenario flawlessly.
Section 5. Using the yield curve.
So we've solved the theoretical breakdown, but how is this actually used in the real economy? The yield curve is quite literally a financial crystal ball. Analysts use it for 4 main practical applications. First, as we just saw, forecasting interest rates. The curve's shape tells us exactly what the market expects the future to look like. Second, it helps massive corporations determine borrowing and lending maturities. If the curve is super steep, a company might choose to borrow short-term now rather than locking in a high long-term rate. Third, it allows portfolio managers to select individual securities by hunting down bonds that are priced inefficiently compared to the curve. And fourth, investment banks use the curve as the absolute baseline for pricing any new debt issues they bring to the market.
So, you're no longer just an observer on the sidelines. You are now fully equipped to read the structure of interest rates yourself. You understand the risk premiums hiding in plain sight, and you know exactly how to decode the shape of the yield curve. So I'm going to leave you with this provocation. Pull up the yield curve for today's market. Look at its slope. What is it predicting for our economy right now? Are we expecting a boom, or are we bracing for a fall? The answer is written right there in the rates. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.